On April 26, 1986, a routine power outage test was conducted on a Unit 4 reactor of the Chernobyl Nuclear Power Plant near the city of Pripyat in the then Soviet Union. The test should have been harmless and simple, but it was nothing like that. There were mistakes made by the workers, and problems in the reactor's design caused an explosion that is still tagged as one of the deadliest explosions the world has ever seen. But what happened? How did things get so FUBAR? Let's start from the beginning. The Chernobyl power complex was located about 130 kilometers north of Kyiv, Ukraine, and 20 kilometers south of the border with Belarus. It had 4 units of RBMK-1000 nuclear reactors. Between 1970 and 1977, Units 1 and 2 were built, while in 1983, Units 3 and 4 of the same design were constructed. Southeast of the plant, a man-made lake about 22 square kilometers in size was built next to the Pripyat River, which flows into the Dnieper. This lake was built to provide cooling water for the reactors. The Soviets developed and built the reactor as a graphite-moderated pressure tube type reactor that uses fuel with 2% more uranium than usual. It's a light water reactor that boils, and the steam goes straight to the engines through 2 loops without going through a heat exchanger. As water pumped to the bottom of the fuel ducts moves up the pressure tubes, it boils. This makes steam that powers 2 500-megawatt electric engines. The water keeps the blades cool and also makes steam that turns them. Inside the vertical pressure tubes is uranium dioxide fuel covered in a zirconium metal. The extra parts of the fuel lines go through both the core's bottom plate and its cover plate and are welded to them. Then, there is a special refueling machine that makes it possible to switch out fuel bundles without having to shut down the reactor. The reason for all these big grammar is to help you understand how it all went down. A test or an experiment was meant to be carried out to find ways to optimize the reactor for better performance. Prior to 1986, an earlier test was carried out in 1982 but failed. The first test showed that the turbine generator's activation voltage wasn't high enough. It couldn't keep the magnetic field that was wanted after the turbine trip. The electricity system was changed, and the test was done again in 1984. But once again, it failed. The test was done a third time in 1985, but this time there were no results, because there was a problem with the recording tools. 3 tests were done on the reactor before 1986, and they all failed. That alone should have been a cause for concern, but I guess it wasn't to the Soviets. The test was scheduled again for 1986, but this time during a controlled power down of the reactor unit. 4. A test procedure had been made, but the people who wrote it didn't know that the reactor would act strangely under the expected working conditions. People thought it was just an electrical test of the generator and not a complicated unit test, even though it involved critical unit processes. At that time, the rules said that this kind of test didn't need to be approved by either the Soviet Nuclear Safety Inspector or the organization in charge of designing the reactor. So basically, anyone could conduct the test without approval, and that's what happened. At exactly 23 minutes past 1, the test began. The scram began when the AZ-5 button, also called the EPS-5 button, of the Nuclear Emergency Protection System was pressed. This activated the drive mechanism on all control rods, even the manual control rods that had been pulled out earlier. Control rods are rods, plates, or tubes filled with hafnium or boron that are used to control how the power of a nuclear reactor. By absorbing neutrons, a control rod stops the neutron from creating more fissions, which can be catastrophic. It shouldn't have happened, but when the AZ-5 button was pressed, control rods were pushed into the nuclear core. A power spike happened a few seconds into the scram. The core got too hot, which broke some of the fuel rods. In less than 3 seconds, the reactor's power went over 530 megawatts. For comparison, a megawatt is 1 million watts, and 530 is 530 million watts, enough to power a city. As the scram went on, the reactor's output jumped to about 30,000 megawatts thermal, which is 10 times its regular working output. This was the last number on the power meter on the control screen. Some people even think the power surge could have been 10 times that high. It wasn't possible to figure out the exact order of events that destroyed the reactor and the power unit building. But one thing was certain: the next thing that happened was a steam explosion, like when a steam boiler blows up from too much air pressure. More fuel lines were broken by this blast. Then about 2 or 3 seconds after the first explosion, there was a second, stronger blast that spread the damaged core and stopped the nuclear chain reaction. It is thought that the blast had as much power as 225 tons of TNT. People outside of Unit 4 said that sparks and burning chunks of material were shooting into the air above the reactor. They started a fire when some of them fell on the roof of the machine hall. The fuel lines ejected about 25% of the red-hot graphite blocks and material because it was too hot for the fuel lines. When the graphite came in contact with air, it caught fire. After the bigger blast, some power plant workers went outside to get a better look at how bad the damage was. Alexander Yuvchenko, one of these survivors, says that when he stepped outside and looked up at the reactor hall, he saw a very beautiful laser-like flash of blue light that seemed to be flooding up into infinity. See, to begin with, everything regarding the nuclear reactor was just done badly, rushed, and just all in all bad. You know how when you rush things in order to meet certain expectations and 8 times out of 10, it never works out because you didn't carry out the adequate and required steps needed? That was exactly what happened with Chernobyl. For starters, bitumen, a flammable substance, was used to build the roofs of the reactor building and the turbine hall, which was highly against safety rules. At least 5 fires started on the roof of Reactor Unit 3, which was right next to the just-exploded Reactor Unit 4. And Unit 3 was still running. It became very important to put out those fires and keep the cooling systems of Reactor 3 safe. The head of the night shift at Reactor 3, Yuri Bagdasarov, wanted to turn off the plant right away for obvious safety reasons. But the chief engineer, Nikolai Fomin, would not let him. Instead, he gave the workers potassium iodide tablets and respirators and told them to keep working even as everywhere was burning. It was still Bagdasarov's choice to turn off the reactor at 5 a.m. Soon after the accident, firefighters came to put out the fires. A firefighter squad from the Chernobyl power station, led by Lieutenant Vladimir Pravik, was the first to arrive at the scene to tackle the fire. Nobody told them how dangerous the nuclear smoke and debris were, or how radioactive the place was. The firefighters thought the accident was nothing more than an electricity fire. Grigory Kamel, the driver of one of the fire engines, later described what happened. We arrived there at 10 or 15 minutes to 2 in the morning. We saw graphite scattered about. Misha asked, "Is that graphite?" I kicked it away. But one of the fighters on the other truck picked it up. "It's hot," he said. The pieces of graphite were of different sizes, some big, some small enough to pick them up. We didn't know much about radiation. Even those who worked there had no idea. There was no water left in the trucks. Misha filled a cistern, and we aimed the water at the top. Then those boys who died went up to the roof, Vashchik, Kolya, and others, and Volodya Pravik. They went up the ladder, and I never saw them again. Lieutenant Vladimir Pravik, the leader in charge of the firefighters, died on May 11, 1986, from severe radiation sickness. To protect Unit 3 and keep its core cooling systems working, the first thing that had to be done was to put out fires on the station's roof and in the area around the building that housed Unit 4. Helicopters helped by dropping more than 5,000 tons of sand, lead, clay, and neutron-absorbing boron on the reactors that were on fire. Historians think that about 600 Soviet pilots took risks with dangerous amounts of radiation to fly the thousands of trips that were needed to cover Unit 4 in order to keep radioactivity out. The fires were put out by FUBAR, but a lot of the firemen were exposed to a lot of radiation. The fire in Unit 4 didn't go out until May 10, 1986, thanks to the graphite. Eyewitness reports of the firemen who were involved before they died were shown on the CBC TV show Witness. One of them said that the radiation tasted like metal and made his face feel like it was covered in pins and needles. After this happened, the government swung into action and did what they do best: lie and deny. Despite the ensuing danger of radiation, the population in the nearby city of Pripyat were not evacuated. In fact, the townspeople didn't know what just happened. They went about their normal lives. But a few hours after the blast, a lot of people started getting sick. Later, they said they had terrible headaches, metallic tastes in their mouths, and couldn't stop coughing and vomiting. So even the government of Ukraine, where the nuclear plant is located, did not get prompt news about the accident because the plant was run by people in Moscow. A letter written on July 28, 1986, and found in the KGB files goes into more detail about how lying and hiding the truth about the Chernobyl accident was an organized practice controlled at the highest level of the Soviet government. The letter is in our description below. This internal note made it clear that in the Soviet Union, people were not allowed to talk about the radiation situation, the contamination, the scale of the decontamination work, or radioactive contamination, of the natural environment, food products, and feed exceeding permissible concentrations. The letter has a lot more cases of information that was marked as secret and couldn't be shared. Even neighboring countries were unaware of the threat that was on their borders. The winds at the time pushed the nuclear cloud west and then north. It went over Germany and the Netherlands and only touched the easternmost parts of France before heading north to the UK. Most of the damage was done in the Southern Alps, Corsica, and parts of the Vosges and Jura mountains in the east. France wasn't very exposed, so the government didn't do anything extra to protect the people at the time. People in France, on the other hand, saw a very different response in Germany, where the government gave out iodine pills and told people not to eat fresh food. This difference led to the idea that France was only trying to protect its agriculture industry and wasn't being honest with the public. On April 28th, in the morning, a worker at the Swedish Forsmark nuclear power plant used a radiation scanner to check his shoes and found an unusually high amount of radiation. At first, the power plant managers were afraid that the leak might have been coming from their own plant, but it was quickly found that the radiation was coming from another nuclear facility. The workers at the power plant raised the alarm because the weather trends pointed to the neighboring USSR. It was only under Swedish pressure, following the discovery at Forsmark, that Moscow admitted that the nuclear particles came from Soviet territory and that there had been an accident. However, the Soviet government didn't say right away how bad the accident was, saying that the radiation situation was under control and that the other reactors were placed in industrial reserve and weren't at risk. Of course, we now know that this wasn't true. The full scope of the damage was not revealed by the Soviet government until the 25th of August, 3 months after the disaster, and it was done because of a meeting with the UN and the IAEA. Chernobyl was massive. Early in the morning on April 27th, about 36 hours after the first explosion, the government finally ordered the evacuation of Pripyat. At first, the people were only supposed to leave for 3 days, but later, this decision was made permanent. By 11:00 on 27th April, buses had arrived in Pripyat to start the evacuation. This is the actual evacuation broadcast announcement.
Внимание, внимание! Уважаемые товарищи! Городской совет.
At first, the Soviets only admitted to the world that there had been a small accident, but when they started to evacuate more than 100,000 people, it started to dawn on everyone around the world that this was no small accident. At 21:02 on April 28th, a 20-second message reading, "There has been an accident at the Chernobyl Nuclear Power Plant," was shown on the TV news show, Vremya. This was the first time the Soviet Union made a public statement about a nuclear disaster. Now, things were getting bad. Doctors around the region saw a spike in the number of cancers and leukemias. Children were born with rare deformities, including frogs' legs and their hips twisted outwards. Others had heart defects and thyroid cancers, all thought to have been caused by radioactive iodine. Despite all these, the Soviets were still denying the effect of the explosion. The officials insisted that all this was due to poor food and poverty, and unrelated to Chernobyl. Meanwhile, in bare, prison-like hospitals, parents would thrust children at foreigners who came to help or were doing volunteer work, and they would beg these foreigners to take them, or at least their children, to their countries. Some would plead for medicines or money for medicines. Oncologists were so short of chemotherapy drugs that they would give one sick child half a protocol and another the other half, condemning both. Yet officials would say it was anecdotal evidence and had nothing to do with Chernobyl. Now came a wave of abortion like the world has never seen before. People were scared they would give birth to deformed babies, so any woman who was pregnant would prefer the child be aborted than risk having a deformed child. Plus, if the child wasn't deformed, the radiation in the atmosphere would cause problems for the infant baby, and with no adequate medicine, the baby would die. So, instead of going through all that, why not just abort now? Worldwide, an estimated excess of about 150,000 elective abortions may have been performed on otherwise healthy pregnancies out of fears of radiation from Chernobyl. The statistical data doesn't involve the Soviet Ukraine-Belarus abortion rates, as they are presently unavailable. Following the accident and the lies told by the government, journalists and many people mistrusted many medical professionals.
In Belarus, but also in Ukraine and in Russia, got thyroid cancer that can be attributed to Chernobyl.
In 2016, a group of records were declassified and put on the website of the Ukrainian Center for Research on the Liberation Movement. These 28 documents from the archives of the Ukrainian Security Service, or the Ukraine KGB, were about the Chernobyl nuclear accident, and they included technical notes about the construction and running of the Chernobyl plant in its early years. There are also immediate post-disaster reports, as well as discussions of societal views of and responses to the 1986 accident. The link to the document is in the description below. These documents just showed how lackadaisical the Soviets were. You know how your boss tells you to do something and doesn't care how it is done, or if you didn't sleep at all to achieve those tasks, all they know is that it must be done. That's just exactly what the Soviets did. Corruption, bribery, and bad workers' safety and health were the cause of Chernobyl. The Hiroshima bombing, done by the US, is still marked as one of the deadliest bombings in human history. But the Chernobyl accident resulted in 100 times more radiation than the bombs dropped on Nagasaki and Hiroshima combined.